The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, and the first thing I did when I read it was spill my coffee. Not because my hands shook, though they did. They still do sometimes since the stroke, but because I actually laughed. The kind of laugh that has nothing to do with anything being funny. My daughter had driven 2 hours from Knoxville to help me with my morning routine, and she was standing in the kitchen doorway when I started laughing, and the look on her face told me she thought I'd finally gone over some edge she'd been worrying about for months. "Dad?" I handed her the letter instead of trying to explain it. She read it twice. Then she sat down across from me at the kitchen table and said nothing for almost a full minute. The letter was from an attorney in Nashville. It informed me that my ex-wife, Carol, was pursuing a civil harassment and stalking order against me. She claimed I had been following her, appearing outside her workplace, sending threatening emails, and calling her repeatedly with disturbing messages. The documented incidents spanned from January through May of this year. She was seeking a permanent restraining order and $175,000 in damages for emotional distress. My name is Frank Malone. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a firefighter and fire investigator for the city of Chattanooga before a stroke took that from me. The stroke happened January 3rd of this year, 2 weeks before Carol's allegations supposedly began. I had been in Erlanger Medical Center for 11 days following the stroke, then transferred to a rehabilitation facility in East Ridge, where I lived for the next 4.5 months. I had partial paralysis on my left side. I relearned how to button a shirt in March. I walked unassisted for the first time in April. I did not drive again until late June. Every single date in Carol's lawsuit, I had been in a hospital bed or a rehab facility, with nurses checking on me every few hours, with occupational therapists logging my progress, with security cameras covering every entrance and exit. I laughed because the absurdity of it was almost artistic. My daughter did not laugh. She called a lawyer. Carol and I had been divorced for 2 years. The marriage had lasted 23 years and ended badly, the way marriages often do when the money runs out and the respect goes with it. I'd retired early because of some complications from smoke inhalation, nothing as serious as what came later, and the pension wasn't what we'd planned on. Carol had grown up expecting a certain kind of life. I didn't blame her for wanting it. I blamed myself for a long time for not being able to give it to her. By the time she filed, we'd been sleeping in separate rooms for almost a year and barely speaking. The divorce was brutal in the financial sense, but quiet in every other way. No screaming, no scenes, just 2 people sorting through 23 years of shared objects and deciding what belonged to who. We had 1 daughter together, and she was grown and settled, so there was no custody battle. We had agreed to leave each other alone. I had kept that agreement. The attorney my daughter found was named Bill Garrett. He was 60 himself, formerly a public defender, now in private practice out of Chattanooga. He had the kind of unhurried manner that I associated with men who had seen genuinely terrible things and decided not to let smaller terrible things bother them. When I laid the letter in front of him and explained my situation, he read it once, set it down, and asked me one question. "You have documentation from the rehab facility?" 4.5 months of it. He nodded. "Then we have a defense, but tell me about the emails." That was the part I hadn't been able to explain away by laughing. Carol's attorney had included printouts of 16 emails, all sent from an address that was unmistakably mine, the Gmail account I'd used for 15 years, frankmalone61@gmail, containing messages that ranged from hostile to genuinely threatening. In one, the sender told Carol she would regret leaving him. In another, there were specific references to her new workplace, a dental practice in Brentwood where she'd taken a receptionist job after the divorce. In the most disturbing one, dated March 12th, the sender described watching her car in the parking lot and knowing her schedule. I had sent none of them. I hadn't accessed my email at all from January through most of February because I couldn't hold my phone steady enough to type, and my daughter had been managing my basic communications for me. When I finally got back online in late February, I'd been using a tablet with a stylus. "Someone accessed my account," I told Bill, "or they created a lookalike address. Which is it? Do you have 2-factor authentication set up?" I didn't. I'd never been particularly careful about digital security. I was 64 and had spent most of my career in firehouses, where cybersecurity meant locking your locker. Bill pulled out a legal pad. We're going to need to get Google's records for that account. Login history, IP addresses, the works. And I want you to think very carefully about who would benefit from Carol believing you were harassing her. I thought about that question for a long time, driving home. Carol and I had no unfinished business. The settlement had been signed. The house in Hickson had been sold. She'd taken her half and moved to Nashville to be closer to her sister. I hadn't contested anything. I hadn't called her. I had wished, privately, that things had ended differently between us. But I was not the kind of man who translated private wishes into threatening emails. My daughter came back that evening with groceries and information. She had been doing her own digging, the way her generation does, with nothing but a phone and too much determination. Mom has a boyfriend, she said, setting bags on the counter. She's been with him since last November. His name is Ray Turner. I found him on her Facebook. I didn't know Carol was seeing anyone. It shouldn't have mattered. It didn't matter. Except that it was new information, and new information had a way of reshaping what I thought I understood about a situation. What do you know about him? Not much. His profile is mostly locked down. I can see one photo. He looks. She paused, tilting her head. She showed me the profile picture. A man in his early 60s, standing on what looked like a boat dock, squinting into the sun. Average height, lean, wearing the kind of canvas jacket I'd owned a version of for 20 years. Similar facial structure. Not identical, but similar enough that if someone was looking for him from a distance, in bad lighting, they might make a mistake. I looked at the photo for a long time. Something about the posture bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately name. Bill called the next morning with preliminary news. He had reached out to Carol's attorney, a man named Douglas Firth, to request the standard evidentiary exchange. When Bill explained that I had medical documentation proving my physical location during every date listed in the complaint, Douglas went quiet in a way that Bill described as not the quiet of a man who's surprised, more the quiet of a man recalculating. They scheduled a phone call for the following Friday. In the meantime, I filed a request with Google for my account activity. The results came back in 4 days and were clarifying in the worst possible way. Someone had accessed Frank Malone's 6-1 from an IP address in Nashville on 14 separate occasions between January and May. They had never accessed it from Chattanooga, never accessed it from East Ridge, never accessed it from the rehab facility. Every single login had come from Nashville. I had not been in Nashville once this year. I printed everything and drove to Bill's office. He reviewed it without speaking, his reading glasses pushed up on his nose. When he finished, he set the pages down carefully. Your account wasn't hacked in the traditional sense, he said. Someone knew your password. Nobody knew my password. Who had access to your devices? Your email was open on any of them? I thought about it. My phone. My laptop. My daughter had used my laptop occasionally during my hospitalization to handle some correspondence for me. My daughter knew my account, but that was a thought I refused to follow. There was someone else. When Carol and I were still married, she had known all my passwords. We'd shared a family plan, a joint account, a shared calendar. She'd had access to everything. I had changed most of my passwords after the divorce, as our mediator had suggested, but I had a habit of reusing old passwords with minor variations. Frankly, it was possible that Carol or someone close to Carol had figured out my new password from the old ones. Or someone had installed something on one of my devices at some point before the stroke. It was also possible. I called my daughter. She said she'd been careful, that she'd never shared my login information with anyone, and I believed her completely and immediately. She then said something that stopped me. Dad, I looked more at Ray Turner's profile. Something's off. He only joined Facebook 14 months ago. His friend list is tiny, like 40 people. Most of them have generic-looking profiles. And I can't find him anywhere else online. No LinkedIn, no old photos, nothing before last year. I wrote that down. Bill had a contact, a former FBI agent named Dave Kowalski, who had gone private after retirement. Dave was based in Atlanta but traveled. Bill called him that afternoon. Dave agreed to take the case. Dave was a compact, precise man in his late 50s who gave the impression of someone who processed information faster than he let on. He drove up to Chattanooga 3 days after Bill called him, and we met at Bill's office. I laid out everything I had: the medical records from Erlanger and the rehab facility, the Google account history, the printed emails, the photo of Ray Turner. Dave studied the photo of Ray Turner for a longer time than seemed necessary. "How did you find this?" he asked my daughter. "Facebook, through my mom's friends list." "When did she add him as a friend?" She checked. "November of last year, 2 weeks after he joined." Dave nodded slowly. "Walk me through the divorce. Any other men in the picture before this one?" We told him what we knew, which wasn't much. Carol had moved to Nashville, gotten the receptionist job, joined a book club, started attending a different church. She'd rebuilt her life cleanly and quietly. The first anyone had heard of Ray Turner was when my daughter had spotted him on Carol's profile a few months back. "And Carol initiated this lawsuit," Dave said. "Not the boyfriend. Carol's name is on the filing. Her attorney represents her, but someone gave her the emails. Someone showed her evidence of the alleged stalking." He let that sentence sit. "You think he brought it to her?" I said. "I think someone who wanted you out of Carol's life permanently would need Carol to believe you were dangerous. You can't just tell someone that. You need to show them. 16 threatening emails and a stalker who shows up at her workplace, that's a compelling story. Especially if she already has complicated feelings about you." He didn't say the next part out loud, but I heard it anyway. If Carol was predisposed to believe the worst of me, someone could take advantage of that. "I'm going to need a few days," Dave said. He called Bill on Thursday evening. I was at Bill's office the following morning. Ray Turner did not exist. Dave had run the full suite Social Security traces, DMV records, professional licensing in Tennessee and Georgia, and every surrounding state, court records, property records, nothing. The Facebook profile photo was a stock image, purchased from a photographer in Dallas, and used without attribution. The other photos on the profile were lifted from a dozen different public accounts, men of similar age and build, arranged to look like a coherent life. Someone had built Ray Turner from scratch, 14 months ago. I sat with that for a moment. "Then who is Carol dating?" I asked. Dave had an answer. It had taken him 2 days to find it, working through a Nashville law enforcement contact who had agreed to help quietly. A man had been seen regularly with Carol at her church and at a restaurant near her apartment. He matched Ray Turner's general description, that is, he matched my general description. But his real name, the name connected to his actual identity, was Glenn Pryor. Glenn Pryor, age 61, originally from Memphis. 3 prior incidents in his history, 2 in Tennessee, 1 in Alabama, all involving women he'd formed relationships with after their divorces. In one case, the woman's ex-husband had been sent to prison after a harassment campaign that investigators later suspected had been fabricated. That case had never been formally reopened. Glenn Pryor had no prior stalking convictions of his own because he had never been caught doing it. What he left behind him were ex-husbands whose lives had been dismantled, and women who believed they had been protected from dangerous men. Dave leaned forward in his chair and explained the pattern clearly, the way a man explains something he has seen before and finds professionally disturbing. Men like Glenn Pryor didn't stalk women in the conventional sense. They targeted women in vulnerable transitions, fresh divorces, new cities, disrupted social lives. They positioned themselves carefully, learned everything about the woman's history, identified the ex-husband as a threat, and then manufactured evidence that confirmed the threat. It kept the woman frightened and dependent. It eliminated competition, and it worked because the women had no reason to doubt the evidence they were being shown. "He's been watching Carol since before he introduced himself," Dave said. "The 14 months of the fake Facebook account, that was his preparation period. He learned her routines. He found out about you. When you had the stroke, he saw his window. I thought about January 3rd. The stroke had come at 3 in the morning. I'd woken up with the left side of my face numb and my left arm not responding, and had managed to dial 911 before losing consciousness. A week later, I'd been catheterized, couldn't feed myself, couldn't reliably form sentences. I had been as helpless as a person can be while still technically being alive. Glenn Pryor had known that. He'd used it. The emails started January 19th, Dave continued. 16 days after your stroke. He needed you conscious enough for it to be plausible that you were sending them, but incapacitated enough that you couldn't defend yourself. How did he access my account? We think Carol gave him access, not intentionally. She may have mentioned your password at some point, old passwords, the kinds you share during a marriage. He's good at extracting information without appearing to ask for it. Bill had been quiet through most of this. He spoke now. We need to decide how to proceed. We have the medical records, the Google logs, the IP addresses, and now a background on Glenn Pryor. We can present all of this to Douglas Firth before we get anywhere near a courtroom. Does Carol know? My daughter asked. She had been sitting beside me, and her voice had a particular quality to it, not anger exactly, but something close. Almost certainly not, Dave said. She believes the story she's been told. The emails are real, she received them. The threatening language is real. She has no reason to suspect the man she's been leaning on for the past several months is the one who sent them. She needs to know, my daughter said. Yes, Dave agreed. But not yet. If we tip Pryor off before we have enough to act on, he disappears. He's done it before. He has a practiced exit. The response to the lawsuit was filed the following Monday. Bill did it methodically and without drama medical records from Erlanger, nursing logs from East Ridge Rehabilitation, the Google account IP history showing every login had come from Nashville, and a 3-page summary of Glenn Pryor's history, prepared by Dave, presented without accusation, but with considerable detail. Douglas Firth called Bill the next afternoon. He requested a meeting. We drove to Nashville on a Wednesday, Bill and I, Dave in a separate car. The meeting was at Douglas Firth's office on West End Avenue, a quiet suite on the 4th floor with tall windows and the kind of furniture that announced its own expense. Carol was there when we arrived, sitting at one end of the conference table with her hands folded. She looked exactly as I remembered her, and also entirely different, thinner, and guarded in a way I hadn't seen before. A man I had never met was seated beside her. I recognized Glenn Pryor immediately from Dave's surveillance photos. He was 61 but presented younger. My height, my build, silver hair kept short, wearing a sport coat in a shade of blue that I might have chosen myself. He extended his hand across the table and introduced himself as Carol's partner, and said he was there to support her through what had been an extremely difficult period. I shook his hand. He had the practiced warmth of someone who had done this many times. Bill presented our defense the same way he had laid it out in the filing, but in person it landed differently. He walked through the medical records date by date, matching each of Carol's allegations to a nursing log entry, a physical therapy note, a physician's order. For the dates in March, I had been in occupational therapy twice daily and documented on closed-circuit camera in the facility's common room. For the dates in April, I had required assistance with all mobility and had not left the second floor. Carol's face changed as Bill spoke. The guardedness gave way to something more confused. Then, Bill presented the Google records. Every one of these emails was sent from an IP address registered in Nashville, Bill said. Mr. Malone has not been in Nashville at any point this year. We have cross-referenced the IP addresses and can confirm they originate from a residential address in the Green Hills neighborhood. Douglas Firth looked at the printouts without expression. Glenn Pryor looked at them too, and his expression was also controlled, but his jaw had tightened in a way that didn't match the rest of his presentation. I'd like to note, Bill continued, that we've also commissioned a background report on Mr. Turner, here, whose legal name appears to be Glenn Pryor. He placed a copy of Dave's summary on the table, including 2 prior incidents in Tennessee and Alabama, in which men were targeted with fabricated harassment campaigns, while the women they had previously been involved with formed relationships with Mr. Pryor. The room was very quiet. Carol turned to look at Glenn. He was still looking at the papers on the table. Glenn, Carol said. Her voice was low. This is a fishing expedition, he said, an attempt to deflect from the documented harassment by muddying the water with unsubstantiated the IP address, Carol said. She turned back to Bill. The emails came from an IP address in Green Hills? Yes. I live in Green Hills. Yes. Glenn has been staying with me since March. Glenn stood up. He said something to Douglas Firth about procedural irregularities and the impropriety of introducing unverified background reports in an informal meeting. His voice remained measured, but he was standing now and his body language had changed entirely, the practiced warmth replaced by something colder and more angular. Carol was still looking at the papers. Dave had entered the conference room from the hallway, where he had been waiting. He set a folder on the table, near Carol, not near Glenn. "Miss Malone," Dave said, using her maiden name, which she'd taken back after the divorce. "I'd like to show you some additional documentation, if you're willing to look at it." Glenn said, "I don't think that's—" "Glenn." Carol's voice had found something harder underneath it. "Sit down." He sat down. Dave opened the folder. Surveillance photographs. Glenn Pryor, photographed over 3 separate days, in what Dave had identified as preparation activities. Entering a drugstore and purchasing a prepaid phone. Sitting in a car outside the dental practice in Brentwood where Carol worked, before they had supposedly met. A photograph from November of last year, 10 days before his first contact with Carol at a church event, showing him outside the church on a Sunday morning, watching the exit. "He was surveilling you before you met him," Dave said quietly. "The church, the book club, the workplace. He selected you, Miss Malone. He learned your patterns first." Carol's hands, still folded on the table, tightened. Glenn stood again. "This is harassment. You've brought fabricated surveillance photos and a fraudulent background check to intimidate my partner, and I'm not going to sit here." "The emails came from your IP address," I said. It was the first time I had spoken directly to him. My voice was steady. 31 years of emergency response teaches you to be steady in the moments that count. You accessed my email account using a password Carol told you about from our marriage. You sent 16 emails to Carol from my account over 5 months while I was in a hospital bed learning to walk again. You hired someone, or you did it yourself. But either way, you used my name to frighten her, to make her afraid of me, to keep me out of her life. He looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were intelligent and flat, the eyes of someone doing calculations. "I have nothing more to say here," he said. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He turned toward the door. Dave was closer to the door than Glenn had realized. He didn't block it. Dave is not large, and it wasn't that kind of situation, but he did say, clearly and without raising his voice, "Mr. Pryor, there are 2 Nashville police detectives in the lobby who would like to speak with you. They've been briefed on the IP records and the background report from Alabama, including the case that was never officially reopened." Glenn Pryor stopped walking. He stood with his back to the room for a long moment. Then he turned around. Whatever he had been wearing on his face for the past 2 hours was gone now, and what was underneath was something harder and more vacant. He sat down. Carol was crying, not loudly, in the contained way of someone who has decided to feel something but not perform it. She was looking at the surveillance photograph from the church parking lot. Glenn, sitting 20 feet away from the church exit, watching for her. 10 days before she had spoken to him for the first time at a coffee hour after Sunday service, where he had introduced himself as new to the area, recently relocated from Memphis, a little lonely, looking to find community. I didn't look at Carol. I looked at the table. The meeting ended. The detectives came up from the lobby. Glenn Pryor was escorted out. He did not speak again except once, at the door, when he said in a conversational tone that this was all going to look very different in court. Doug Firth stayed in the conference room after everyone else had left, except Bill, me, and Carol. He said he would need a day to review everything. He said it in the voice of a man who had already reviewed it and knew exactly what he was dealing with. Carol and I sat at opposite ends of the table for a little while after that. The Nashville afternoon had gone golden outside the tall windows, and the room had the strange quietness of a place where something large had just been resolved. "I believed him," she said. She wasn't asking me to forgive her for it. She was just naming the fact. "The emails looked like me," I said. "I've written emails like that. Not to you, but the voice was right. He knew everything about you, how you talked, what words you used, things I must have told him." She shook her head slowly. "I was frightened, Frank. After the first email came, I was genuinely frightened, and he was there every time I was frightened, right there, being calm and telling me I wasn't crazy to be scared. That's the design, I said. He made himself necessary by creating the fear. How did you figure it out? My daughter started it. She noticed his profile was thin. Carol looked out the window. She has good instincts. She does. We were quiet for another minute. How's the recovery going? Carol asked. Slow. My left hand is still unreliable. I'm walking fine now, mostly. I didn't know about the stroke, she said. Not right away. Your daughter called me in February, and I didn't call back, because by then I'd already seen the first emails, and she stopped. I was building a story about you in my head, the kind of story that fit the emails, and when she called, I told myself it was a manipulation, that you were using her to contact me. I didn't say anything to that. I'm sorry, Frank. I know. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was something. Acknowledgement, maybe. Two people recognizing what had been done to them without pretending it undid the damage. The formal dismissal of the lawsuit came through 6 weeks later. Bill filed a counterclaim against Glenn Pryor for identity theft, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The criminal case moved slowly, the way criminal cases always do, but it moved. The Nashville detectives worked with their counterparts in Alabama to formally reopen the earlier case, and what they found there added significant weight to the charges accumulating here. Glenn Pryor had done this before with a thoroughness that suggested it was not improvised. He kept records. The detectives found files on his laptop that documented Carol's life in a granular way that was deeply unsettling: her schedule, her regular routes, her relationships, her emotional history as he had gathered it through careful conversation over months. He had been building a case against me before I ever had any reason to know he existed. His bail was set at $200,000. He posted it, which told me he had resources I hadn't known about. His attorney immediately began arguing that the IP evidence was circumstantial and the background material was prejudicial. The case would take time. Carol moved out of the Green Hills apartment into a smaller place near her sister in Brentwood. She texted me twice after that, once when the lawsuit was formally dismissed, once on my birthday in November, just a short message saying she hoped the recovery was continuing well. I replied both times. We weren't friends, and we weren't going to be. But whatever she had been to me for 23 years, she didn't deserve what Glenn Pryor had tried to do to her any more than I deserved it. My daughter drove up the weekend after the counterclaim was filed and made a large, unnecessary amount of food, and we watched college football and didn't talk about any of it for 2 full days. It was exactly what I needed. The left hand has improved. I've started physical therapy for it, specifically exercises I do every morning at the kitchen table with a rubber band and a set of foam balls. Some days, it's almost normal. Other days, it curls up like it's trying to protect itself. My neurologist says the recovery curve for stroke is long and nonlinear, which is a clinical way of saying that progress is real, but you can't predict it. I've been talking to some of the younger firefighters at the station I retired from. Not working, just talking. They've asked me to come in once a month and speak to the newer investigators about reading fire scenes, the things you learn after 30 years that don't make it into training manuals. I said yes. It gets me out of the house and it gives the hours a shape they'd otherwise be missing. I think about what Glenn Pryor counted on. He counted on the fact that I was flat on my back in a hospital and couldn't investigate. He counted on Carol's existing complicated feelings about me filling in the gaps of his story. He counted on the idea that a threatening email from my own account would be more convincing than any denial I could offer. He had thought it through, the way a predator thinks things through, patient and methodical. What he didn't count on was my daughter paying attention to the thin Facebook profile. What he didn't count on was Bill Garrett's steadiness, or Dave Kowalski's instinct for the places where a false identity develops hairline cracks. What he didn't count on was Google's servers logging every IP address like a deposition that never gets tired. There's something I've started saying when people ask me about it, because people do ask. Not many, but enough. I tell them that the hardest part wasn't being accused. The hardest part was knowing that the accusation was structured from real material, real emails, real threatening language. Real photographs of someone who looked enough like me in bad light. A lie built from real components is the hardest kind to dismantle, because every true thing it contains makes the false things more convincing. The way to dismantle it isn't by insisting it's a lie. You can insist all you want. The way is to go piece by piece, document by document, IP address by IP address, until the structure of the thing becomes visible, and what's holding it up turns out to be a 61-year-old man with a manufactured identity and a practiced smile. The titanium rod is in my left wrist now. A small plate, actually, from a fall during early rehab when my coordination wasn't what it is now. The doctors said it would heal completely. They were mostly right. It aches in the cold, which in Chattanooga means it's going to ache about 4 months a year for the rest of my life. I've decided that's acceptable. When I had the stroke, the neurologist told me that the brain, even at 64, retains a significant capacity to rebuild what it has lost. It routes around damage. It finds new paths. The old ones are gone, but the destination is still reachable, just by a different road. He meant it as encouragement, and it was. But I've also thought about it in a different way since everything that happened with the lawsuit. Glenn Pryor tried to close roads, block the exits, make Carol afraid of the only direction that might have brought us to something resembling peace, make me look like the kind of man who sends threatening emails to a woman he once loved. But the records existed, the timestamps existed, the server logs existed. The security cameras at East Ridge Rehabilitation recorded me walking the corridor at 6:45 in the evening on the exact date he claimed I was standing in a parking lot in Brentwood. He built his story, assuming the records wouldn't be organized, wouldn't be requested, wouldn't be lined up against his story date by date. He assumed wrong. I'm still rebuilding. The process is slow and sometimes boring and occasionally humiliating in small ways I won't describe. But I'm here. My name is on no active lawsuits. The Nashville Police Department has an open file with Glenn Pryor's name on it, and enough in that file to keep it open for a long time. Carol is safe. My daughter is well, and some mornings, when the left hand cooperates and the light comes through the kitchen window at the right angle, the whole unlikely chain of it, the stroke, the lawsuit, the fake boyfriend, the Google IP logs, Dave Kowalski's careful notes, feels less like a catastrophe I survived and more like a problem that got solved, one document at a time, one piece of truth laid next to another, until the weight of them became something Glenn Pryor simply could not move. He had thought being flat on my back made me powerless. He didn't understand that truth doesn't need you to be standing to do its work. You just have to be the one who refuses to let it get buried.